As you've heard on Bridge City News, there will be some layoffs when it comes to the $3.8 billion merger between Cenovus Energy and Husky Energy. To talk about this in a little more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, joining me once again from Edmonton. Tyler, company officials are estimating up to 25% of its workforce, or around 2,000 positions, will be cut.
Yeah, that's right. So combined, the companies have something like 8,600 employees, so 25%, around 2,000 people. Now, most of those, as with a lot of these layoffs, looking to be in downtown Calgary once again. So a bit of bleak news for the energy industry, and also a bit of bleak news for, Calgary specifically, which has, been battered by the economic downturn in some unique ways compared to other parts of the province. Now, in terms of the politics of the matter, the UCP obviously concerned about this, concerned about the state of the energy industry, saying that they have redoubled their focus on things like diversification. The NDP, of course, saying that, oh no, their diversification strategy is not good. They need to do more, and so on and so forth. So that's sort of the political back and forth that's been happening the last couple of days here in regards to those layoffs.
You know, I have friends and family in Calgary, and many of them have been laid off, and it's been a real challenge for a lot of us, especially here in southern Alberta. TC Energy has hired American contractors to build a pipeline through the United States. More than $1.6 billion in contracts have been issued to 6 U.S. unions, creating about 7,000 jobs. Hey, that's great for the Americans, but what about us here in Canada? We need some of those jobs too.
Yeah, isn't that the truth? I think it's a good thing, more generally for people working, but a good indication of TC Energy's confidence that this pipeline is going to continue going forward. We've talked in recent weeks about how if Joe Biden becomes president, he has been not so enthusiastic about KXL. So I think the fact that we are less than a week from the election and that TC Energy has moved forward with, as you say, billions of dollars, almost $2 billion in spending on building this pipeline, that strikes me as a very promising sign. And the other thing I should mention is there was a teeny tiny little bit of good news on the energy front in Alberta this week. At the same time, as we just discussed, that Cenovus and Husky looking at laying off staff, Suncor actually announced that it was going to be moving some of its head office staff, or office staff, I should say, from Mississauga and Oakville out to Calgary, and that's something like 1,000 positions. So I spoke with the mayor of Calgary, Naheed Nenshi, the other day, and he said, this is a good sign for the city. So glimmers of hope, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. Any good news we can take at this point in time, especially when it comes to the support of our oil and gas sector. Tyler, earlier this week, we saw wildcat strikes at various healthcare facilities around the province, including here in Lethbridge at the Chinook Regional Hospital. Bridge City News was there on location. Healthcare workers were upset with the UCP government's announcement of 11,000 job cuts. Now, the Labour Board sent the workers right back to work, and they're not happy about it.
Yeah, it was, I mean, I'm sure for you guys as well, it was a bit of a shock Monday morning, settling in to see what the day was going to bring and then thinking, oh my goodness, breaking news, got to get over to it. It was the first time I'd gone out to cover a story out in quite a while, I've got to say, which was, almost a novel experience. But yeah, wildcat strikes, which means basically that the union membership decided to go on strike without a proper strike vote, without going to their union leadership, things like that. So a little bit of a surprise to absolutely everybody. Thousands of workers across the province. You had people up in Peace River, Edmonton, Calgary, Red Deer, Lethbridge, as you said. So these were mostly sort of support staff, shall we say, not to diminish their contributions, but we're talking instrument cleaners, cleaners more generally, food service workers, some licensed practical nurses, but the registered nurses, for example, in a different union. So this went on, lots of people out and about protesting, sort of some high drama. And then the labor board said, well, no, this is an illegal strike, back to work with all of you. And the Alberta Federation of Labor, the AFL, Gil McGowan's outfit, saying that this is just sort of the start of labor action. They've launched a new campaign to get Albertans out to support union workers. It's going to be some drama for a long time, I think. As you said, 11,000 jobs cut, many of them by attrition, but nearly 10,000 of them by privatizing some of these services that we just talked about, taking them from union workers and giving them to private contractors. So it's going to be an issue, no doubt about that, for weeks and months to come.
And I guess what the NDP is bringing up right now, saying you're going to turf all of these union positions and give them to what, maybe businesses that are friendly towards the UCP?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a line of attack one could take. I think we'll have to wait and see whether or not that happens. One of the interesting things about this, though, is the NDP didn't come out as, sort of full-throatedly as one might have expected to support these workers. Now, it became apparent fairly early on that this was not a legal strike action. So the NDP, I think, being a little bit careful with that. But in the days since and the days before, I should say as well, they've certainly been saying they're attacking workers, they're attacking Albertans, so on and so forth. So there's political hay to be made out of this, even if they weren't quite as bullish as one might have expected.
Tyler, the province is looking at potentially introducing some new childcare legislation. Let's talk a bit about that.
Yeah, it happened on Wednesday afternoon, and basically the big thing about it seems to be 24-hour childcare. I don't have children; had never occurred to me that you might dump your child at daycare for overnight, but that seems to be one of the things they are looking at. There's also going to be some sort of changes to the licensing. They're going to be using a risk-based assessment. So a daycare, for example, that has had fewer issues will have less frequent inspections, things like that. This comes after some of the red tape reduction measures cut some of the licensing measures, and those, I believe, lapse early next year at some point. So this is, one of the latest legislative moves by the UCP that is going to sort of modernize childcare, more accessible childcare in terms of the hours of availability for the workers who aren't just on 9 to 5 shifts, things like that. So a lot of the details are going to come by regulation once the legislation is passed. But once again, no doubt this is going to be a hot political potato in the legislature in the weeks to come.
I'm thinking of some of my early days in radio many, many moons ago when a lot of people would work the graveyard shifts. They'd have small children, so something like that would have definitely come in handy. COVID-19 cases are rising in many regions across the province. Now, some mandatory restrictions on group sizes are coming back. Tanner, what will they look like?
Yeah, the big one is basically we're back down to 15-person limits on gatherings. There's a whole pile of exceptions to these, wedding ceremonies, for example, funeral services as well, I believe, are on that list. But as you said, big spikes in numbers. We had something like 1,400 cases over the weekend, more than 500 a day on 2 consecutive days. So, not looking great. Been a fair amount of drama in the legislature this week about the government's pandemic response, particularly to do with the COVID-19 tracing app. Alberta has its own, and the federal government has a competing one.
The Alberta government has offered up $50 million from the TIER Fund. That's the industry-funded clean energy fund for pitches on new projects. Tyler, it says the measure will create around, 9,000 new jobs?
Yeah, that's what they're hoping. So this tier fund is sort of an emissions reduction fund. Money comes back into this pot that is supposed to go out to clean energy projects. So they seem to be looking basically for sort of shovel-ready pitches. This money is there to help with costs, things like that. I didn't get a sense of what the timeline might look like for when these things could be up and running. But, we've talked about this in recent weeks too, that the UCP has really not stopped governing during the pandemic. All sorts of things happening, whether that's emissions reduction, childcare reform. There's just so much happening at the same time as the pandemic. It's remarkable in some ways, I would say.
Now, when it comes to the pandemic itself, and I know in Ottawa, at Parliament Hill, only half of the MPs are actually coming out. They're doing a lot of it via Skype or just through Zoom conference calls. What's happening at the legislature? Are a lot of the MLAs deciding to stay home in their constituency and then just chiming in via video?
Well, they are still working in person now. There are physical distancing requirements in the legislature, so they're sort of separated with a chair in between them and things like that. But a lot of this stuff is happening in person at the legislature. Now, many things aren't happening in person to the same degree. Most of the government press conferences, for example, and updates are still exclusively by video or teleconference. The NDP is doing some of its press availabilities via Zoom, but they also do have some in-person availability. So it hasn't been as sort of dramatically digital, shall we say, as has been the case in Ottawa.
The province recently announced millions of dollars to support agriculture programs being transferred to both the University of Lethbridge and Lethbridge College. We're pretty excited about it around here.
Yeah, this is part of a pretty large reform of the way agricultural research is done, I should say, in the province. And it strikes me as one of those stories that has flown under the radar a little bit. What the government has sort of fundamentally done is set up this independent arm's length oversight body of agricultural research. So they're taking this out of the Department of Agriculture and Forestry and giving it to this body, which then disperses funds. And as you said, Lethbridge has some of this, Olds has some of this, Lacombe as well, and they're doing research on organic fertilizers and just piles of money for 1 to 3 years kind of programming and stuff like that. So, what that's going to look like in the long term, what that research is going to look like is going to be very interesting to follow. And it's actually come up in the legislature a little bit with the NDP being concerned that these jobs have been taken out of government and not so much privatized, but outsourced maybe. So a little bit of small political drama on that, but it's certainly for areas like Lethbridge, big change in what is one of the biggest industries in the province.
Oh yeah, we're very big about agriculture right around here. But Tyler, let me ask you something. When you talk to some of the ministers there in Edmonton at the legislature, is Alberta looking at possibly reinventing itself because of the big hit to the energy sector, putting more money into agriculture, maybe into green technology, or what else?
Yeah, there has been the diversification thing has been such a topic of conversation for so many years. I mean, during the NDP, for example, you can look at the way that craft breweries really took off with a lot of support from the government. And now this government is putting money towards hydrogen projects. There was talk of small nuclear reactor projects some weeks ago. There's the clean tech announcement that we just talked about a moment ago. So there is a lot of talk about diversification and about new industries. It's kind of an odd thing because the NDP is saying, "Oh, the government isn't doing enough," and the UCP is turning around and saying, "Oh, we're doing plenty," and the fault for the economy not turning around is with the NDP and the fiscal state they left the province in and stuff like that. So there's a little bit of sort of usual partisan mudslinging on this, but if there was a word for, I mean, if you set the pandemic aside, I think in some ways you could say the political word of the year has been diversification in this province.
But you know what? I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted a lot of businesses and our economy in a huge way. Let's circle back to Lacombe. You mentioned them earlier here. They received some good news that it will get a clean energy and fertilizer facility. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, that's right. So this is a clean energy fertilizer facility, as you said. I believe they're planning on it being a zero emissions facility and reducing emissions in some capacity. Some of the more precise details are just slipping out the edge of my mind here. But I believe the government is funding the construction of that project. And it's one of, sort of, as you said, many of these things that are happening at Olds College, at Lethbridge College, and the University of Lethbridge, but Lacombe getting this sort of special facility itself.
Alberta correspondent with the National Post and our legislative reporter, Tyler Dawson. Thanks for joining me today from Edmonton.
Thanks, Hal.